This video is going to go over making some basic buttons in Photoshop. Now I'm going to go ahead and create new, and I'm going to be sticking with the web most common setting. Now buttons you could be using for a lot of times websites don't have specific buttons but have more navigation bars and such, but like an app would have buttons. It really depends on what you need. So I'm going to go ahead with web. I'm going to leave the default of 1366 pixels wide by 768 tall. 72 is the resolution because it is going to be displayed on the screen, and I want it to be RGB color. The background contents, the setting of that does not really matter. I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And what I'm going to do is show you how to make buttons using the shapes in Photoshop, and you can achieve quite a bit without really having drawing abilities. What you are going to want to make sure is that you have your layers palette up and available. That's probably the most important thing that we'll be working with today. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have it selected with layer 1. All right. When we work with shapes in Photoshop, it will actually make layers for us. So actually probably the layer 1 click is not absolutely necessary. So let's say I want to make a simple rectangular button, and I'm going to go ahead. Let's make let's say a blue one. I'm going to go ahead and go to the foreground color, and let's pick a nice blue. I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to go to this tool here, which are shapes. And if I click and hold it, you can see the different shapes that are available. We have rectangle, rounded rectangle, ellipse, which is essentially circle, polygon, the line tool, or the custom shape tool where you can make arrows and such. I'll show you how to do that. But let's make a simple rectangular button. So I'm going to keep it on rectangle tool, and to draw it, just like many other programs, you simply click, hold down, and drag out the size of the button you want. Now notice, if this is my entire screen, I don't want a button that's like half the screen. I want one that's an appropriate size button. Now you might say, this really doesn't look much like a button. It's just a blue rectangle, right? So we can change that pretty easily. I'm going to go to the Move tool here, and I need to find my Layers palette. It kind of popped away. And if you notice now, it shows in here Rectangle 1. All right, so now what I want to do is apply a layer style to this to make it look more like a button. So if I have that selected, I can go down to the FX icon, and notice it says add a layer style. So if I click on that, it comes up with a bunch of different options. So we could have bevel and emboss, stroke, adding a shadow or a glow. And I think what I would like to do is let's go right to bevel and emboss. That would be fine. Now what's going to happen is it's got a panel with all kinds of different settings, and I can manipulate all of these at one spot. And here is our button. So what I would recommend when you're editing, keep this up so you can see what's going on, because it updates as you go, especially if you have the preview button checked. So I've got bevel and emboss, and I can choose what type of bevel, like inner bevel and such, or I could do like a pillow emboss, and it really just changes kind of how things look. Let's just do for inner bevel, and I can change the depth of it. So notice how that kind of changes. The size. Now what I would recommend is when you do this, be strategic with how you're using this. If I slide this up all the way, notice it loses all of the effect there. So what I'm going to do is just move it a little bit until it looks like what I need. I can soften it so it's more of a smooth button, or I can keep it more sharp. Okay, so you kind of just play with this to see what you like. The angle is going to say, where is the light coming from? Now at this point, it's coming from straight down, the setting, which doesn't really give a great dimension. I'm going to click it off to the side a little, and it seems to make things a little bit nicer. If it says use global light, that will change this lighting for everything in that in your document. There are other contour things you can choose that will give different looks, and a lot of times you just kind of click through and see what looks good to you. Okay, notice how different it is, like just based on that. I'm going to go back to the basic one, I think. And you can change how you want the highlights to be and how dark you want them to be. So this is kind of just like a basic bevel. And then let's add one more thing. How about if I add a drop shadow? That'll give it a little bit more dimension. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down here, and if I only click on the drop shadow box, it'll give a drop shadow, but it won't bring me to the settings. So what I want to do is actually click on the drop shadow name, and then it'll give me a bunch of settings for drop shadow. So I can choose the distance, how far away I want that drop shadow to be. Notice too far away, it starts getting kind of weird. So I want to, depends on how far I want it to look like it's hovering. I can do the spread, like how large is this going to be, and the size also. And if you do too much, it just blurs away. So you probably just want to do that a little bit. But the distance is necessary for it to actually look like something. The opacity is going to kind of decide how dark this is going to be. I'm upping that a little bit. All right, so I'm going to say OK. Now, if we look over at our layer, we've got our rectangle, and it has another thing underneath that says effects, and it shows what effects we applied. Now, if I actually use the move tool and move this rectangle, notice everything moves with me, including the drop shadow. So that's kind of nice. If I want to change any of these, I can just double click on it. Let's say I want to change the bevel and emboss, and it'll bring up that panel again, so I could change things around. I'm going to say OK. Now, this being a plain rectangular button, I don't know what it does, right? It could be anything. So I think I need to label it. So let's get some text on there. So I'm going to go to my text tool here. And one thing I want to point out is if I have my shape selected and I'm going to my text tool, if I roll over it and I say, hey, I want to type into it, notice how the cursor changes where it has a circle around it. If I go off of it, it just makes a regular box. When I roll over the shape, since it's selected, it thinks that I want to fill the shape with some text. And that's not really what I want to do. I want to put the text on top. So initially, I'm going to type off of it and then move it on. Now, I don't think I want blue text on top of my blue button. So let's change the text color to, how about I'll do, actually, let's kind of do a yellow. That'll pop off. All right. So I'm going to go ahead. Once again, I don't want to click on this right away. I'm going to click down off of this, and I just clicked. Okay. I didn't drag a box. Now I can just type something. So I'm typing push. I'm going to highlight this, and I can make it whatever size I want. So up top here, I can change the size. I can pick a preset size, or I can just type in a number. Let's try 18. Okay. And we can't see it very well since it's on white, but when we move it onto the blue, it'll be fine. So I'm going to use my move tool. I have my text here, and I can just move it on top of this button. Now, this may be the right size. If I wanted to change it at all, I have my layer selected. I can use my text. Now, the trick is I have to be careful where I click to select. If I click nearby and I click on it, it thinks I want to make new text, which is not what I want to do. So I'm going to hit escape. Oops, pardon me, undo. Okay, so what I want to do is make sure to roll over it and then click, and then I should be able to select it and change the size as I want. So let's make it a little bit larger. I could probably even go to 30. Okay, and I'm going to move that into place. Okay. So it says push, so I have some indicator of what this button does. Okay, so let's look at these layers. So let's say I wanted to move the button over here. Now, as is, if I go here and I grab this rectangle and I move it, notice the text did not come along with it. I'm going to undo. So what I'd like to do is group these. Now, what I can do is make a group. This is one way. There's several ways you can do it. I'm going to go up into this menu, and I'm going to say new group. And I'm going to go ahead and call this push button. Label it something that you know what it is. And now it's like a little folder. I can go ahead and take my layers and drag them in. And I'm going to drag this in. And the same ordering applies. So let's say I drag this in and the text is moved below the, let's see, below the rectangle, notice I no longer see my text. It is still there, it's just that it's being hidden by my rectangle. And I can see it, like if I turn off the visibility of the rectangle, I can see that the text is there. So all I need to do is grab that and move it above the layer so I can see them. Now what's pretty cool is if I grab that group, the thing that says push button, and I go to move it, now the whole thing moves. Okay, so that's pretty handy. All right, so let's do, how about a button that looks like an arrow? So I'm going to go over to the shapes, click and hold, and there are some here. One says custom shape tool. And what it lets me do is choose a custom shape. So up in the top, it chooses what shape do I want to make. So there's a whole mess of them. So, oh, Valentine's is coming up. I could make a heart, or I could, make different types of arrows. And there are ones that you can load in. I'm going to make this beefy arrow here. So I'm going to click on that, and all I have to do is click and drag out the shape. Now, if I'm not satisfied with the color of this, let's say I don't need it to be blue, I can go over into the layers where the shape is, double click on the icon, and it'll bring up a thing where I can change the color. So let's say I want it to be, how about a green? So there we go. We'll go with a green arrow. I'm going to say OK. And then I can, the filters apply there as well. Actually, I'm looking at this. Notice that my shape is now a part of the group push button. So if I grab push button and I move this, I might not want this arrow to move along with it. So to get this out, I'm going to go to my arrow. Right now it's just by default called shape 1. I'm going to click and drag it outside of that group. Sometimes it's a little finicky. So notice you can see the hierarchy, like by how it's tiered. So the shape and the push button are next to each other essentially. There is a little arrow next to push button, and you can click on that to collapse the layers inside of it so you can just work with the group if you'd rather. So here's our arrow. Now I can move it independently, and I can go to push button, and that's its own thing too. I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of filters to this, probably similar to what I had here. So I've got my shape. I could go to the FX. I'm going to just start with the bevel. Why not? And I can try different things. So I've got emboss. That's not doing much for this. Let's just do back to inner bevel again. I'll just pick a little something here. Now up and down just kind of decides where the light source is coming from. And that's not what I wanted. Let's pick this. Let's see if there's a different look. Actually, I kind of like that one. I'm going to say okay. Oh, if I wanted to add, let's say I do this and I go, oh, actually, I really wanted to add a drop shadow. So I can go back into effects and I can go to drop shadow and add that if I wanted. And there are also things, like I said, there's like an outer glow. There's gradients. You can add a pattern to things just by choosing this and then selecting what pattern you want. So you can make it kind of crazy. Well, let's go with that. That's kind of fun. I'm going to say okay. Another thing you can do, which essentially would work in a similar way with these layer effects, is you can go right to text. So let's pick a color. How about I do, let's pick an orange. I'm going to go here for some text and choose click this. And I want something a little beefy. So I'm going to go up here and choose in the fonts kind of a thicker font because I'm going to add a stroke to it. And if it's a little too thin, it'll look kind of strange. So let's see if I can find like Impact's a nice one. I'm going to make it a little bit larger just for the demo. So I've got click this. Okay, and I can add other effects. Now here's one. So if I've got this, it doesn't have to be a bevel. I can go to effects, and there's one called, where is it? I'm not seeing it. So let's just, stroke, there we go. So I'm going to move this out of the way, and notice it creates an outline for the text, and I can choose how large I want it to be. Now, right now it's set to inside, so when I create it larger, it starts just squishing the inside. I'm going to go ahead and make this outside. And I'm going to change the color. Let's do kind of like a darker gray. So if I do this, I could make it huge. You just start losing the effect. But I kind of like it where it's big enough where it fills in the little cracks, but you're not losing the overall outer shape. So I could do this and say okay. So now I've got a different look. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a button, but it could be essentially a graphic element on your screen. Let's see, one more thing I'd like to show you. Let's say you've got an arrow and you want to duplicate it and flip it the other way. I think an easy way to do that, once you've got it in place. So I believe my shape 1 is my arrow. If you're ever not sure which element it is, I like to use the eyeballs to find it. So what you do is you go over here, and if you click off the eyeball and then back on, whichever one blinks, you can see what item you're dealing with. So let's say I have this shape and I wanted to have an identical arrow. I can right click on it. I can say duplicate layer and say okay. I have a duplicate of it. It's still in the same spot, so I need to move it off. And then I can do things to it like rotate it or flip it. For instance, I could go here under Edit, Transform. I could change the size. I could rotate it. Let's rotate this one. So if I go here, I can just grab it and, aim it whichever way. When I do this, to have it apply, I need to hit the Enter key on the keyboard. And so now when I move it around, it stays in that position. Under Edit, Transform, you can flip horizontal, vertical. You can warp things, scale them, rotate. Typically, scale and rotate and flipping are the ones I use the most. Once in a while, I've had to warp or distort things, but usually those are the most common. So really, there's an unlimited amount of different combinations here. You can try different shapes. You can fill it with different things, add different effects, and you can end up with many different looks for buttons.